Grace had always believed in counting her blessings. At 34, she had so much to be thankful for. A loving husband named Thomas, 2 beautiful children, and a job teaching art at the local elementary school that filled her heart with purpose. Their modest 2-story house in the suburbs wasn't fancy, but it was filled with laughter, finger paintings taped to the refrigerator, and the gentle chaos that comes with building a life together. Faith had always been the steady backbone of Grace's life. Not in a showy way. She wasn't one to quote scripture in casual conversation or judge others for their beliefs. Her faith was quieter, more personal. It was in the silent prayers of gratitude she whispered while watching her children sleep, in the way she found meaning in small everyday moments, and in her unshakable belief that everything happened for a reason. "You're such an optimist," Thomas would tease her, his eyes crinkling at the corners in that way that still made her heart skip after 12 years together. "Even when you're stuck in traffic, you think it's because God wanted you to hear the end of that song on the radio." And she would laugh because he wasn't entirely wrong. Finding meaning in the little inconveniences of life came naturally to her. It was the big things she never had to make sense of, until the Tuesday in October that changed everything. It had been an ordinary morning. Thomas kissed her goodbye at the door, his travel mug of coffee in one hand, car keys in the other. He had a meeting with a client across town. His construction business was finally taking off after years of hard work. And this new project could be their big break. "Don't forget, Lisa's mom is dropping the kids home today after soccer," Grace reminded him. "And we need milk, got it?" "Milk and kids," he replied with a wink. "Love you. Love you more," she said, their standard farewell. She watched him back out of the driveway, waving as he drove away. She never imagined those would be their last words to each other. The police officers arrived at her classroom door just after lunch. Grace knew the moment she saw their solemn faces in the doorway of her art room. Something inside her recognized the truth before a single word was spoken. The principal took over her class while they led her to a private office. Car accident. Head-on collision. Drunk driver crossing the center line. Thomas died instantly. Words floated around her like debris, none of them landing, none of them making sense. She kept shaking her head. They had the wrong person. Thomas was at his meeting. He was stopping for milk on the way home. He would be picking up the kids from Lisa's mom. But Thomas wasn't doing any of those things. Thomas wasn't doing anything at all anymore. The next days passed in a blur that Grace would later struggle to recall. Her mother flew in from Arizona. Her sister drove up with her husband and stayed for 2 weeks. The house filled with casseroles and flowers and sympathy cards. People hugged her and said things like, "He's in a better place and God has a plan." Words that had once brought her comfort but now felt like knives. The children, 8-year-old Ben and 6-year-old Lily, responded to the loss in different ways. Ben became quiet and serious, suddenly intent on being the man of the house, and while Lily asked the same heartbreaking questions over and over. "When is Daddy coming home?" And, "Why can't heaven have phones?" Grace would hold them close, fighting back her own tears to reassure them, making promises about their father watching over them that she was no longer sure she believed. Nights were the hardest. After the children fell asleep, Grace would lie awake in the bed that felt too big, too empty. Sometimes she would reach for her phone at 3 in the morning, halfway through typing a text to Thomas before remembering. Other times she would curl around his pillow, breathing in the fading scent of his shampoo, and let the tears come. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered into the darkness one night a month after the funeral. "I don't know how to be both parents. I don't know how to fix the leaky faucet or coach Ben's baseball team or make any of this okay." She waited, hoping for some sign, some sense of Thomas or God or anybody hearing her. The silence that answered felt heavier than ever before. Grace returned to work after 6 weeks because they needed the income, and because the empty house during school hours felt like it was swallowing her whole. Her students were gentle with her in their childlike way, bringing her extra drawings and saving her the blue markers because they knew blue was her favorite color. Her colleagues checked in on her, offered to watch the kids, brought her coffee. She appreciated their kindness while feeling increasingly distant from normal life, as though she were watching it all through a thick pane of glass. The hardest moments came unexpectedly. Finding Thomas's half-used bottle of aftershave in the bathroom cabinet, driving past the hardware store where he would spend hours comparing paint samples for their projects. The first parent-teacher conference where she sat alone, hearing about Lily's progress in math while fighting the urge to turn and ask Thomas what he thought. 3 months after the accident, Grace stopped praying. It happened without conscious decision. One night, kneeling beside her bed as she had done since childhood, the words simply wouldn't come. She opened her mouth and found only questions, angry ones. Why Thomas? Why now? Why us? The man who had hit Thomas had survived with minor injuries. He had 3 previous DUI convictions. How was that part of any divine plan? How could she possibly find meaning in this senseless loss? Grace began avoiding church. She made excuses about the kids being tired or having too much homework. She let calls from their pastor go to voicemail. When her mother gently suggested that returning to services might bring comfort, Grace changed the subject. The Bible that had sat on her nightstand for years was moved to a drawer, then to the bookshelf in the spare room. Her sister Jenny noticed the change during a weekend visit. "You're not yourself," she said as they washed dishes after dinner, the children playing in the backyard. "And it's not just grief, it's something else." "I'm fine," Grace said automatically, the response she'd perfected for well-meaning questions at work. At the grocery store, at school pickup. "You're not," Jenny insisted, "and you don't have to be." "But I'm worried about you." Grace set down the plate she was drying, her hands suddenly shaking. "You want to know what's wrong? I'm angry. At God, at the world, at that drunk driver, sometimes even at Thomas for leaving us." The admission burned her throat like acid. What kind of person does that make me? Jenny wrapped her arms around Grace, dish soap and all. "It makes you human," she whispered. "And God can handle your anger. He has pretty big shoulders," but Grace wasn't ready to test those shoulders. Instead, she poured herself into practical matters, learning to fix things around the house, organizing the children's schedules with military precision, putting one foot in front of the other. She smiled for school pictures and birthday parties. She helped with homework and made pancakes on Saturday mornings, but inside, something had gone silent. As the 6-month mark approached, Grace noticed Ben hiding in his room more often. One evening, she found him sitting on his bed, clutching one of Thomas's old sweatshirts and crying quietly. "I can't remember what his voice sounds like anymore," Ben confessed when she sat beside him. "I try, but it's fading away." Grace pulled her son close, her heart breaking all over again. "I have videos," she said. "On my phone. We can watch them together." It was the first time she had offered to look at pictures or videos of Thomas with the children. Until then, it had felt impossible. That night, the 3 of them huddled together on the couch, watching clips of Thomas teaching Ben to ride a bike, Thomas dancing with Lily in the kitchen, Thomas making his famous goofy face. They laughed and cried together, and something tiny but important shifted in Grace's heart. "I miss him," Lily said, her small face serious in the glow of the phone screen. "Me too, baby," Grace whispered, "every single day." As she tucked the children into bed later, Grace felt the weight of their pain alongside her own. How could she help them make sense of this loss when she couldn't understand it herself? The questions that had been building for months pressed against her chest, demanding answers she didn't have. That night, for the first time in months, Grace reached for the Bible in the spare room. Not to read, not yet, but simply to hold something that had once brought her certainty. As she touched the worn cover, one question rose above all others. Why do we lose the people we love? Winter arrived, bringing with it the 6-month anniversary of Thomas's death and a string of holidays that felt impossible to face. Grace found herself standing in the decoration aisle at the store, staring blankly at the Christmas lights and ornaments, unable to move. Thomas had always been in charge of hanging the outdoor lights. He'd climbed the ladder while she held it steady, both of them laughing when he inevitably tangled himself in the strands. Last year, he'd surprised her by adding a light-up reindeer that the kids had fallen in love with. "Can I help you find something?" a store employee asked, breaking into her thoughts. Grace put the box of lights back on the shelf. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think I need these after all." That night, after the children were asleep, Grace called her mother. "I don't think I can do Christmas this year," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Every tradition we had, it was all with him." The silence on the other end of the phone told Grace her mother was choosing her words carefully. "What if I come stay for a while?" her mother finally offered. "Just until after the new year. The kids should have some kind of Christmas, honey." Grace wanted to argue that the children would be fine without decorations and presents and Christmas cookies, but the truth was she wasn't sure they would be. Ben had already asked twice if they could get a tree like Daddy always picked out. Okay, Grace agreed, relief and guilt washing over her in equal measure. But I can't promise I'll be good company. Her mother arrived 2 days later with 3 suitcases and a determination to bring some light back into their home. She didn't push Grace to participate in holiday preparations, but quietly took over, baking Thomas's favorite sugar cookies with the kids and helping them make paper chains for the modest tree she brought home. Grace watched from a distance, going through the motions at work, nodding when appropriate during parent meetings, even managing a smile at the school's holiday concert when Lily's class sang Jingle Bells with more enthusiasm than skill. But inside she felt hollow. One evening, her mother found her sitting alone in the darkness of the living room, the only light coming from the small Christmas tree in the corner. "The kids made you something," her mother said, sitting beside her on the couch. She handed Grace a handmade ornament, a photo of Thomas in a frame decorated with glitter and popsicle sticks. In the picture, he was laughing, his eyes crinkled at the corners in that way she loved. "They thought it would be nice to have Daddy on the tree," her mother explained gently. "I hope that's okay." Grace stared at the ornament, feeling her chest tighten. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. Her mother didn't pretend to misunderstand. "None of us do," she said simply. "We just keep trying anyway." The pastor from their church called the week before Christmas, asking if they would be attending the Christmas Eve service. It had always been a tradition. Thomas in a red sweater, the kids dressed in their holiday best, the family holding candles during the final hymn. "We're still figuring out our plans," Grace lied, knowing full well she had no intention of going. The thought of sitting in that familiar pew without Thomas beside her felt unbearable. "We've been missing you," the pastor said kindly. "The congregation has been asking about you and the children." "Please thank everyone for their concern," Grace replied, her tone carefully neutral. "We're managing." After hanging up, she found herself standing in front of the bookshelf in the spare room, staring at her Bible. She pulled it down, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. For so many years she had turned to these pages for guidance, for comfort, for answers. Now as she flipped it open, the words seemed to blur together, meaningless. Grace tried to pray that night, kneeling beside her bed as she had done since childhood. The words caught in her throat. All she could feel was anger, hot, unexpected, and overwhelming. How could she pray to a God who had allowed this to happen? What kind of plan included taking Thomas from his children? From her? The Bible went back on the shelf. The prayers remained unsaid. When her mother suggested they might all feel better after attending church, Grace changed the subject. Christmas came and went in a blur of forced smiles and carefully wrapped presents. Grace's mother stayed through January, quietly helping with the children, grocery shopping, and the endless practical details that never stopped needing attention. She didn't push Grace about church or faith, but Grace sometimes caught her mother praying quietly at the kitchen table early in the morning. One afternoon in late January, while the kids were at school, her mother broached the subject Grace had been avoiding. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "maybe I should stay a bit longer. The kids seem to be doing better having a routine, and I worry about you being alone." The offer brought both relief and shame. Grace had always been independent, capable. Now she found herself nodding in agreement, admitting without words that she couldn't manage alone. Her mother sold her condo in Arizona by spring. What had started as a temporary visit slowly transformed into a permanent arrangement. Grace converted the home office into a bedroom, boxing up Thomas's drafting table and blueprints, storing them in the attic with so many other pieces of the life they'd shared. "You don't have to do everything at once," her mother said, finding Grace sitting among the boxes, clutching one of Thomas's sweaters. "Some things can wait." But Grace felt stuck in an impossible place, unable to move forward with Thomas's things surrounding her, yet unable to part with these tangible reminders of him. Each item she packed away felt like losing another piece of him. The 1-year anniversary loomed ahead like a dark cloud on the horizon. Grace watched the calendar with growing dread as April approached. The school counselor sent home suggestions for helping children through the anniversary of a parent's death. Friends began calling more frequently, checking in, offering to take the kids for playdates. "What are you planning for the day?" Jenny asked during their weekly phone call. Nothing, Grace said flatly. It's just another day. But they both knew it wasn't. A year without Thomas. 365 days of waking up to his absence. How was that possible when some mornings she still reached for him before remembering? The week before the anniversary, Ben asked if they could visit the cemetery. Grandma says it helps to talk to people even when they're gone, he explained, his small face serious. I have some stuff I want to tell Dad. The thought of facing Thomas's grave on the anniversary made Grace's chest tighten with panic. She had avoided the cemetery since the funeral, making excuses whenever the children asked to go. Her mother had taken them a few times, but Grace always found reasons to stay behind. Maybe Grandma can take you, she suggested, hating herself for the relief she felt when Ben nodded in acceptance. The night before the anniversary, Grace couldn't sleep. She paced the house at 3 a.m, moving from room to room like a restless ghost. In the kitchen, she found a bottle of wine Thomas had been saving for a special occasion. Without thinking, she opened it, pouring a glass with shaking hands. As dawn broke, Grace made a decision. She left a note for her mother, explaining that she needed the day to herself. She would go to the cemetery alone. The morning was unusually warm for April, the sky a clear, painful blue. Grace drove with the windows down, feeling the spring air against her face. The cemetery was quiet when she arrived, the rows of headstones stretching across carefully maintained grass. She found Thomas's grave easily, the granite still new-looking compared to many of the weathered stones around it. Someone had left fresh flowers recently. Her mother, probably. Grace sat down on the grass, unsure what to do next. She hadn't brought flowers or mementos. She had nothing to offer but her anger and her questions. I don't know how to do this, she said aloud, her voice sounding strange in the quiet cemetery. I don't know how to believe anymore. In God, in meaning, in anything. The words started slowly, then began to pour out of her. A year's worth of unspoken pain, of rage, of questions without answers. Why? She finally screamed, no longer caring if anyone heard her. Why do we lose the people we love? Her voice echoed across the silent graves unanswered. Grace buried her face in her hands and wept, deep, wrenching sobs that left her gasping for breath. She cried until she felt empty, hollowed out, with nothing left inside. It was then, in that moment of complete desolation, that she felt someone sit down beside her on the grass. Through tear-blurred eyes, Grace looked up to see who had intruded on her private grief. Grace quickly wiped her tears, embarrassed to be caught in such a raw moment of grief. She hadn't noticed anyone else in the cemetery when she arrived. Turning slightly, she saw a man sitting calmly on the grass beside her, a respectful distance away. He wasn't looking at her, but rather gazing across the rows of headstones stretching into the distance. Her first instinct was to get up and leave. This was supposed to be a private moment between her and Thomas, and the God she was no longer sure she believed in. But something about the stranger's presence felt oddly comforting rather than intrusive. He wasn't staring at her or offering unwanted platitudes. He was simply there, sharing the silence. Grace studied him from the corner of her eye. He looked ordinary enough, simply dressed in a light blue shirt and jeans. Nothing about his appearance was particularly remarkable, yet Grace felt a strange sense of calm beginning to replace her anger. There was something in his eyes, a depth of understanding that made her feel for the first time in months that someone might actually comprehend the magnitude of her loss. I'm sorry, she said finally, her voice hoarse from crying. I didn't realize anyone else was here. The man turned to her with a gentle smile. No need to apologize, he said. His voice was warm, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Some days require all the feelings we've been holding inside to finally come out. Grace nodded, surprised by how accurately he had described what she was experiencing. She looked back at Thomas's headstone, tracing the engraved letters of his name with her eyes. Today marks a year, she said quietly, not sure why she was confiding in a stranger but unable to stop the words. A year without him, the man nodded. The first anniversary is particularly difficult. Something in his tone made Grace look at him more closely. Have you lost someone too? I've known much loss, he said simply. There was no self-pity in his voice, just a statement of fact. And I've sat with many who are grieving. Under normal circumstances, Grace would have politely ended the conversation and left. She had spent the past year avoiding heart-to-heart talks. deflecting well-intentioned questions about how she was really doing. But today, on this hardest of days sitting beside this quiet stranger, the walls she had so carefully constructed began to crumble. "I used to believe everything happens for a reason," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to believe in a plan greater than what we can see. But now," she gestured helplessly at Thomas's grave, "what possible reason could there be for this? What lesson am I supposed to learn from my children growing up without their father?" The man didn't rush to answer, didn't offer the ready-made responses Grace had come to dread from well-meaning friends and church members. Instead, he seemed to truly consider her questions. "Those are fair questions," he said finally. "The hardest ones, in fact." A breeze rustled through the trees overhead, sending a shower of spring blossoms drifting across the cemetery. One landed on Grace's hand, and she stared at it, remembering how Thomas had planted flowering trees in their backyard when they first bought their house. "For future anniversaries," he had said with a wink. Much cheaper than buying flowers every year. The memory, which would have been painful just hours before, now brought a small, sad smile to her face. He loved trees, she said, surprising herself by sharing this detail with the stranger. He could name almost every type we saw on hikes. The kids would point to one and wait for him to identify it. It became a game between them. The man smiled. "Tell me more about him," and suddenly Grace wanted to. After a year of careful conversations where she mentioned Thomas as little as possible, to avoid making others uncomfortable, after months of holding her memories close like precious stones that might be stolen if shared, she found herself wanting to paint a picture of Thomas for this stranger who had never known him. "He built things," she began. "Houses, furniture, birdhouses with the kids. His hands were always creating something new. He couldn't sit still during movies. He'd be sketching designs for his next project the whole time." The words began to flow more freely. He sang terribly but with complete confidence. The kids loved it. He coached Ben's t-ball team even though he knew nothing about baseball, stayed up all night watching videos to learn the rules. Grace pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as she continued. "He was patient in a way I never managed to be. When Lily took 20 minutes to tell a story that should have taken 2, he'd listen to every detail like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever heard." The man listened without interruption, his face reflecting genuine interest in these fragments of Thomas that Grace was sharing. She told him about Thomas's terrible cooking but perfect pancakes, about his collection of ugly Christmas sweaters, about how he had proposed to her at the top of a mountain after a hike that had nearly killed them both. "I keep wondering who I am without him," she admitted, voicing a fear she had never shared with anyone. "We were together since college. I don't know how to be just me anymore." "You're still discovering that," the man said, "and it's okay that it takes time." There was something about his presence that made Grace feel heard in a way she hadn't since Thomas died. Not just listened to, but truly understood. "The hardest part," she continued, "is watching my kids struggle and not being able to fix it. Ben tries to be the man of the house now. He's 9 years old and he thinks he needs to take care of me." Her voice cracked, "And Lily still sets a place for Thomas at the table sometimes. She says it's in case he comes to visit as an angel." Grace wiped fresh tears from her cheeks. "I don't know what to tell them anymore. I used to believe all the things I told them, about heaven, about God's plan, about Thomas watching over us. Now I don't know what I believe." She looked directly at the stranger then, surprised by her own honesty. "I'm angry at God," she confessed. "I've never been angry at God before. I don't know how to reconcile the God I believed in with what happened to Thomas." The man nodded, his eyes reflecting a deep compassion. "Anger is a natural part of grief, even anger at God. But it feels wrong," Grace insisted. "Like I'm betraying my faith." "Real faith can withstand your questions," he replied gently. "Even your anger." Grace stared at him, struck by his words. For months she had been hiding her feelings, ashamed of her doubts, her rage, her inability to find meaning in Thomas's death. Hearing this stranger suggest that her faith might be strong enough to contain all these emotions felt like permission to breathe again. "I just keep asking why," she said, her voice breaking. "Why do we lose the people we love? What's the point of loving so deeply if it can be ripped away in an instant? I keep waiting for an answer that makes sense." "Perhaps," the man suggested softly, "you're asking the wrong question." Grace looked at him confused. "What do you mean?" "Instead of asking why we lose the people we love," he said, What if you asked what their love continues to create in you, even after they're gone? The question hung in the air between them. Grace felt something shift inside her, like a door opening slightly in a room that had been sealed shut for months. I don't know if I can see it that way, she whispered. You don't have to see it all at once, he replied. Just consider the possibility. They sat in silence for several minutes. Grace found herself studying the stranger's face, trying to place why he seemed both completely unfamiliar and oddly recognizable at the same time. Who are you? She finally asked. Why are you here today? The man smiled. Sometimes we find ourselves exactly where we need to be, he answered simply. And today it seems I needed to be here. Grace had a strange feeling there was more to his presence than coincidence. But before she could ask anything else, the man spoke again. Would you share one more memory of Thomas? Something that brings you joy to remember? Grace closed her eyes, letting her mind wander through the years she'd shared with Thomas. So many memories to choose from. Their wedding day, the births of their children, vacations, and ordinary Tuesdays. Finally, a smile touched her lips. Our 10th anniversary, she began. We couldn't afford a big trip, and both kids had been sick that week. Thomas had been working late on a project, and I thought he'd forgotten what day it was. She looked down at her hands, remembering. I was so tired. Ben had been up the night before with a fever, and Lily was going through a phase where she refused to nap. I remember feeling sorry for myself, thinking how different our life was from what I'd imagined when we got married. The memory was becoming clearer as she spoke. I put the kids to bed early and was just sitting on the couch, too exhausted to even watch TV. Then Thomas came home. He had this look on his face, part excitement, part nervousness. He asked me to come outside. Grace's smile grew wider. He had transformed our backyard. Somehow he'd strung lights in all the trees, set up our old tent, and inside was a picnic with all my favorite foods. He had pictures from our 10 years together hanging from the tent ceiling. She laughed softly. The food was mostly takeout, and he'd forgotten drinks completely. But he had recreated our first date, the night we went stargazing in college because neither of us had money for dinner and a movie. We laid in that tent looking up at the stars through the mesh roof, eating lukewarm Chinese food, and it was perfect. More perfect than any fancy restaurant or trip could have been. The stranger's face was warm with appreciation for the story. Love finds its truest expression in such moments, he said. Not in grand gestures, but in knowing exactly what would bring joy to someone else's heart. Grace nodded, surprised by how sharing this happy memory didn't bring the stabbing pain she expected. Instead, it felt like honoring Thomas in a way she hadn't been able to do for months. I've been so focused on what was taken from me, she admitted quietly. Sometimes I forget to remember what we had. The man nodded. That's natural in grief. The absence feels more real than the presence ever did. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Grace found herself studying his face again. There was something in his eyes that seemed to hold both infinite sadness and boundless compassion. Earlier, she said hesitantly, you mentioned that I might be asking the wrong question, about why we lose the people we love. Yes, he replied simply. Then what is the right question? She asked. The man turned his gaze back to the horizon, thoughtful. Perhaps, he said after a moment, the question isn't why we lose people, but what their love continues to create in us, even after they're gone. Grace considered this. I'm not sure I understand. You don't lose the people you love, he said gently. Love doesn't end with death, it transforms. He gestured toward the flowering tree branches above them. Look at these blossoms. Last winter this tree appeared dead. Nothing visible remained of its beauty or life. But the tree wasn't gone, it was transforming. The very essence of it remained, waiting for the right season to express itself in a new way. Grace looked up at the delicate white flowers against the blue sky. But Thomas isn't coming back like spring returns every year, she said, her voice tight with fresh pain. No, the man agreed. Not in the same form. But what if the love between you isn't gone either? What if it's simply changing form like energy that can't be destroyed, only transformed? He shifted slightly to face her more directly. The pain you feel, he continued, is not the absence of love, but its continuation in a different form. Grief is love with nowhere to go. The words resonated deep within Grace, touching something she hadn't been able to articulate even to herself. Think about your children, he said softly. Do you see Thomas in them? Grace didn't have to think about her answer. Every day, she whispered. Ben has his laugh, that full-body laugh that seems too big for his small frame. And Lily has his creativity, the way she sees possibilities in ordinary things. The man smiled. And do you see yourself differently because of having loved Thomas? Grace considered the question. I'm stronger in some ways than I knew I could be, she admitted. I've learned to do things I never thought I could. Fix the sink, build a bookshelf, make decisions alone. She paused. But I'm also more fragile, more aware of how quickly everything can change. Both strength and vulnerability are gifts, he said. Gifts born from loving deeply enough to risk loss. A jogger passed by on the cemetery path, reminding Grace that the world continued its normal rhythms even on this day that felt so separate from ordinary time for her. The depth of your grief, the man continued when they were alone again, mirrors the height of love you experienced. One doesn't exist without the other. Grace felt tears welling in her eyes again, but these felt different somehow. I would still choose it, she said, surprising herself with the realization. Even knowing how it would end, I would still choose Thomas. I would still choose the life we had. That, said the man with a smile that seemed to illuminate his entire face, is the miracle of love. It remains worth the cost even when the cost is tremendously high. He reached down and picked up a small, smooth stone from beside Thomas's grave, turning it over in his palm. When someone we love deeply touches our life, they leave their mark on us, like water flowing over rock, gradually but permanently changing its shape. Thomas has shaped who you are, who your children are becoming. That doesn't end because his physical presence is gone. Grace took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her. Not a removal of pain, but a subtle change in its texture. So you're saying I should focus on how Thomas's love continues to work in our lives, instead of focusing on his absence? I'm suggesting, he replied gently, that perhaps they are the same thing. Your awareness of his absence exists because his presence mattered so deeply. The emptiness you feel is the space his love carved within you, a space that remains sacred even in his absence. He placed the small stone on top of Thomas's headstone. Love that ends when someone dies isn't love at all. It's just convenience or habit. Real love transcends physical presence. It transforms us, and that transformation remains. Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but they weren't the desperate, angry tears of before. I want to believe that, she whispered. I want to see it that way. It takes time, the man said. Grief has its own timeline, different for everyone. Some days you'll feel this truth deeply, and other days the absence will feel too overwhelming to see anything else. He looked at her with profound kindness. Both experiences are valid. Both are part of loving well. Grace wiped her eyes, looking across the cemetery where spring flowers were beginning to bloom on some of the graves. I've been so angry, she confessed. At God, at the drunk driver, sometimes even at Thomas for leaving us. I felt so guilty for that anger. Anger is part of grief too, the man said. It doesn't diminish your love. The worst part, Grace continued, has been feeling that Thomas's death had no meaning, that it was just random and senseless. The man was quiet for a moment. Meaning isn't always found in why something happens, he said finally. Sometimes it's found in what we do with what happens. He gestured toward the headstone. Thomas's death itself may not have meaning, but what his life created in you and your children and your community, that has profound meaning. And how you carry his love forward gives his life continuing purpose. How? Grace asked, suddenly desperate to understand. How do I carry his love forward? The man's eyes were kind but serious. By allowing his love to keep shaping you, by telling his stories to your children, by living with the same open heart that allowed you to love him in the first place. He paused. And eventually by being willing to love again, in whatever forms that might take. Grace shook her head instinctively at this last part, unable to imagine opening herself to such vulnerability again. Not now, the man said gently, seeming to understand her unspoken thought. But someday the love Thomas gave you might give you courage to connect deeply with life again. And when that happens, it won't be a betrayal of him, but a testament to what his love created in you. As he spoke these words, something broke inside Grace, not her heart this time, but the hard shell she had built around it over the past year. Grace couldn't remember exactly when the stranger left. They had sat in silence for a while after his last words, watching the sunlight shift through the trees. When she finally turned to ask his name, the spot beside her was empty, She looked around the cemetery but saw no sign of him walking away. It was as if he had simply disappeared while her thoughts were elsewhere. She remained by Thomas's grave until the sun began to set, feeling something new taking root inside her. Not happiness, it was too soon for that, but a quiet certainty that had been missing for the past year. As darkness approached, she gently touched the headstone one last time. "I'll be back," she whispered. "And next time I'll bring the kids." Driving home in the fading light, Grace replayed the conversation in her mind. Who was that man? His words had reached places in her heart that had been walled off for months. The question of his identity nagged at her, but somehow felt less important than the message he had shared. Her mother was waiting anxiously when Grace arrived home, relief washing over her face as Grace walked through the door. "I was getting worried," she said. "The kids have been asking for you. Are they still up?" Grace asked, glancing at the clock. "Ben is." He insisted on waiting. Lily fell asleep about an hour ago. Grace found her son sitting on his bed, a book open on his lap, though she could tell he hadn't been reading it. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, sitting beside him. Ben studied her face with eyes too serious for a 9-year-old. "Are you okay, Mom?" The question was so familiar. He had been asking it constantly since Thomas died, taking on the role of protector. But tonight, Grace saw it differently. This wasn't just a child trying to be the man of the house. This was Thomas's love continuing through their son. "I'm not okay every minute," she answered honestly. "But overall, yes, I think I am. Or I will be." Ben seemed to consider this. "Did it help?" "Going to see Dad today?" Grace nodded. "It did. I met someone there who helped me understand some things." "Like what?" She thought about how to explain it to a child. "Like how Dad's love is still here with us, just in a different way than before." Ben was quiet for a moment. "I think about him every time I catch a baseball," he said finally. "He taught me how to hold my glove, remember?" Grace smiled. "I remember. So that's his love still here? When I remember the things he taught me." A lump formed in Grace's throat. "Yes," she managed. "Exactly like that." After Ben fell asleep, Grace went downstairs and found her mother waiting with a cup of tea. "Something's different," her mother observed, studying Grace's face. "What happened today?" Grace wasn't sure she could explain it fully, even to herself yet. "I think I found a way to start moving forward," she said simply. In the weeks that followed, small changes began to appear in Grace's life. She pulled out photo albums that had been packed away since the funeral, showing the children pictures of Thomas that made them laugh instead of cry. She hung his favorite painting, a landscape of mountains at sunset, in the living room where they would see it every day. One Sunday morning in late May, Grace surprised her mother by announcing, "I think we should go to church today." Her mother tried to hide her shock. "Are you sure?" Grace nodded. "I can't promise I'll go every week, but I want to try." Walking into the familiar sanctuary felt both strange and comforting. Some people stared. Others came up to welcome her back with awkward hugs. The pastor looked genuinely moved to see her and the children in their usual pew. The service itself was unremarkable. Familiar hymns, prayers she had heard hundreds of times before. But Grace found herself listening with new ears. When the pastor spoke about God's presence in times of suffering, she didn't feel the anger that had become her automatic response. Instead, she remembered the stranger's words. Real faith can withstand your questions, even your anger. After the service, she approached the pastor. "I'm not fully back," she admitted. "I still have more questions than answers." He surprised her with his response. "Questions are welcome here," he said. "Always have been." That afternoon, Grace called Jenny. "I've been thinking about something," she began hesitantly. "There are a lot of people in our town who've lost someone. People like me who are struggling. What if there was a place where they could talk about it honestly, without the pressure to be over it or moving on before they're ready?" Jenny was quiet for a moment. "Are you thinking of starting a support group?" "Maybe," Grace said. "Not right away, but eventually, when I'm stronger." "I think that's a beautiful idea," Jenny replied. "Thomas would love it." The idea stayed with Grace over the summer months. She started attending a grief support group in a neighboring town, listening to others share their stories, gradually finding her voice to share her own. The stranger's words often came back to her during these meetings. "The depth of your grief mirrors the height of love you experienced." One doesn't exist without the other. By fall, Grace had returned to church regularly, though not every Sunday. She had joined the education committee, offering to teach art classes for the children on Wednesday evenings. Creating things with her hands, something Thomas had loved, became a form of prayer for her, a way of connecting with both him and her faith again. In November, with the pastor's encouragement, Grace started a grief support group at the church. Only 3 people came to the first meeting: an elderly man who had lost his wife of 50 years, a young mother whose baby had died at birth, and a teenager whose brother had been killed in an accident. Grace shared her story, including her conversation with the mysterious stranger. "I don't know who he was," she told them honestly. "Sometimes I think—" She paused, still uncertain about voicing this thought aloud. "Sometimes I wonder if it was more than coincidence that he was there that day." The elderly man nodded. "I've had moments like that," he said simply. "Times when comfort came from unexpected places." The group grew slowly. By the 2nd anniversary of Thomas's death, 12 people gathered regularly to share their journeys through grief. Grace didn't have answers for them, only the wisdom she had received and her own ongoing experience of learning to live with loss. On that 2nd anniversary, Grace took the children to the cemetery. They brought a picnic, Thomas's favorite foods, and spent the afternoon telling stories about him, some that made them laugh until tears came. "I still miss him every day," Lily said, arranging wildflowers around the headstone. "Me too, sweetie," Grace replied, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "We always will. That's what happens when you love someone as much as we love Dad." Ben looked thoughtful. "But it doesn't hurt in the same way anymore, does it, Mom?" Grace considered this. "No," she said finally. "It doesn't." 3 years after that first cemetery encounter, Grace stood in the backyard of their home watching Ben play catch with a neighbor boy while Lily painted at the picnic table. Her mother was in the kitchen, preparing dinner with Jenny, who had come to visit for the weekend. Grace touched the simple necklace she now wore every day, a small pendant containing one of Thomas's shirt buttons. Not a formal piece of mourning jewelry, but a personal reminder that she carried him with her. The grief support group had grown into something beyond what she had imagined, with branches in 2 neighboring towns. Grace had discovered a gift for sitting with people in their darkest moments, for creating space where they could express their pain without judgment or pressure to feel better. "Your experience has given you a ministry," the pastor had told her recently. Grace wasn't sure she would use that word, but she understood what he meant. Her own suffering had opened her to the suffering of others in a way nothing else could have done. She still had hard days: Thomas's birthday, their anniversary, moments when something would trigger a memory so vivid it took her breath away. But these days no longer derailed her completely. The pain had transformed, just as the stranger had said it might, into something that gave her strength rather than depleting it. Grace had never been back to the cemetery and found the man who spoke with her that day. Sometimes she wondered if she had imagined aspects of their conversation in her grief. Other times she was certain there had been something more at work. A divine appointment, her mother would call it. Grace couldn't say with certainty who she had spoken with that day, but the message had rebuilt her faith in a way that simple answers or religious platitudes never could have done. Love continues, love transforms, and love remains our greatest teacher, even when those we love are gone.